Welcome to Social Discord. Today we're talking about news literacy and the rise of fake news.
It's very scary to think that of the damage we're doing right now of the public perception of journalism.
You know, it completely desensitizes them from what they're supposed to be informing the public about.
Broadcast stations, they had no interest in news. Like news for decades was a huge money loss.
Hello everybody and welcome to the first episode of whatever this podcast is called. We're recording before we came up with a podcast name, so we're going to roll with it right now because this is what we've got. My name's Dalen Turk.
My name is Kara Tebow.
I'm Curtis Medina.
Curtis, what are we trying to do here? What were your thoughts? You were the one who kind of brought this to me. You gave me a phone call months ago about this idea of wanting to do this podcast. What did you have in mind?
Well, I'm not necessarily wanting to enlighten. I kind of actually want to learn about politics and just how to sort of survive in like the modern age of over, way too much information coming to you from all directions, and kind of an overload, I guess. And so I really just wanted to learn like what is going on, what can we do about it, and sort of share that experience with people who might be listening.
And so with that, each episode is going to be roughly different, depending on the topic. If we needed to expand it to one or two episodes, whatever it may be. For example, this first episode coming up right now, we're going to be talking kind of about news literacy, trust in the media, because obviously that's a huge topic right now. That's something that everyone's having to deal with. Everyone's got that aunt and uncle that's posting some weird conspiracy stuff on Facebook that doesn't necessarily mesh with what, you've got going on in your mind. And so I guess we're trying to bring a little bit more of an understanding to how, as a society, we can look at this and work a little bit, better together at creating more cohesive, I guess, idea of what news is.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right.
To give you a little bit more background, like I said, my name's Dalen Turk. I have a degree in journalism from the University of Montana. There I focus my studies on photojournalism and radio broadcast. I've got experiences in mostly radio newsrooms. But yeah, I guess that's where I'm kind of branching off from, obviously. If you listen to some of our other shows on here, I'm the creator of the Podcast Without Borders Network. Done Explaining Things, 900 Things I Hate, A Point in Time, and Sports Without Borders. So I'm a little all over the place, but I know for Kara and Curtis, this is your guys' first podcast?
First foray into podcasting.
Correct.
Everyone's doing it, so why not?
It's a good time. I think Curtis just looked up the stat, and there's something like 835,000 podcasts out there.
Yeah, that was just the active ones.
The active ones.
That's not counting the ones that, went off 5 years ago or whatever.
That's true. And so
everyone and their mother's doing a podcast.
Everybody, and I don't think my mom's doing a podcast. So, Kara, what's your background in?
Yep. So I also have a journalism degree. I went to Northeastern University. I primarily focused on kind of the public policy aspect of things and how we actually consume news. So how do we present news to people? Why are they consuming it the way they are? And what's our responsibility in terms of what we're giving the people? So
definitely compared to myself, where I was more of creating the news, sounds like you have a better grasp on what we're trying to tackle right now.
A bit more of the theory, yeah. I think it took one or two interviews for me to realize, you know what, I don't really like being yelled at by angry men. So the journalism side for me, more interested in the kind of the why and the how.
Fair enough. It's a tough thing to deal with sometimes. Curtis, how about you?
So I do not have a journalism background, but I am fascinated with all things politics. I don't really find it to be especially entertaining to myself unless I'm learning something. So I kind of look at it as more of a study of humans, kind of like what Kara said, the why is really what I find fascinating. And the other thing that I'm excited about maybe possibly doing with this is that, there's not a lot of perspective on politics from millennials, and I think all three of us are in the millennial range or whatever, and I think that's going to be really important. Everything sort of from a different perspective you might not hear anywhere else. So my background is not in professional politics or anything like that. It's in photography and filmmaking and a bunch of things that a lot of baby boomers would call non-essential garbage.
Non-essential garbage. And I think the whole millennial aspect, because I think we all kind of branch almost all the way either end of the millennial spectrum. I'm the very last year. I was born in 96, so I'm 24.
Baby.
I'm a baby. Because
no wonder you were first to know about podcasts.
Hey, man, just trying to inform the people. And Curtis was one of my first employers. He hired me when I was 18 as a photographer, which is a big risk on his part, but I feel like it worked out.
It did. You're a great employee.
Oh, thanks. But with that, why don't we go and dive into today's topic? So like I touched on earlier, we're going into some news literacy, people. We're going to talk about, how to trust the news, fake news, all that good stuff that we've been dealing with. But we're going to take it back to start off. And so to give a little context to, where all this started. So going back to the 1930s with the Nazi Party in Germany, and this was before it really took off into the whole World War II aspect, before Hitler really started invading Poland and, really becoming that, I guess, militaristic. And they were militaristic, but not to the extent that people think of when they think Nazis. But it was Lügenpresse was kind of the first, but first notorious use of that term, which that actually translates to lying press. So not quite fake news, but it's kind of the first idea of that popping up, especially being used by someone in political power. But I think something that goes a little bit more useful into what the actual aspect of journalism is today is yellow journalism. And that started kind of in the 1980s, 1890s with William Randolph Hearst.
It's so new.
The 1980s.
Madonna started yellow journalism.
I mean, if there was anybody to start it, it's going to be Madonna, right? The pop idol. So yellow journalism was this form of journalism started between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and it was basically them just having this huge feud between each other in New York. And William Randolph Hearst was the first one to really use the style of journalism in the way that it's recognized, and he created these crazy sensationalized stories with these literal huge headlines on his newspapers. They would take up almost half of the front page because it was just big and grabbing, and that's what people saw, and that's what they gravitated towards. And I think we can connect that today, because how many people do you know, and I was talking to Curtis about this, that you'll scroll through Facebook, you'll scroll through Twitter, and the only thing they see is the headline, and that's what they base their news off of for the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time. You're going through Facebook, and a friend has posted, in the big yellow letters or whatever. It's 5 things that'll kill you tomorrow or whatever, and it's well, I want to know what 5 things that'll kill me tomorrow is. So click.
Exactly, and one thing, and you'll see, because with William Randolph Hearst, is he used this type of journalism to attack leaders in the communities, to attack, Joseph Pulitzer, to attack politicians. And they use it as a way to really honestly as a weapon to assert their dominance, within their own monopoly. And there's other...
it was yielding power too. I mean,
yes.
It's just, if you have that resource at your disposal, that's a very powerful weapon. In the right or wrong hands, really.
And I want to separate yellow journalisms from from what's called muckraking, and they're kind of intertwined because they came about roughly at the same time. And yellow journalism faded out a little bit right after the cusp of the 20th century, and muckraking really picked up there with industrialization. But muckraking is more of digging to find that, that juicy, that dirt, that, it's not the most ethical way to go about finding the quote unquote news. Whereas yellow journalism can be straight up just fabricating stories or just making it as sensational as possible just to grab the reader.
And I think Muckraking probably helped launch the investigative journalism piece and people getting in there and digging down dirty. But there was usually some fact-based in that, I think.
Exactly. Because that was a kind of a big fight for the people fighting against, honestly, guys like Gallagher and whatnot, you know, these huge corporate giants that owned Industrialization who, you know, just really kind of spat on the working man, and these muckrakers went in and a lot of times, you know, uncovered these awful conditions and, you know, led to stuff like child labor laws. So in that sense, you know, it was a very important transition in journalism that happened. But with the idea of transitions, another thing we should talk about is the language that is used when we're talking about journalists. And part of that is what we call the quote-unquote media. And so you'll notice in, you know, if you're watching a movie about the 1920s, it'll, you know, say the press. And it's an interesting, and I didn't know this, and Curtis brought this up. We have a little sheet going on here with some facts and whatnot. And the idea of the media actually started in the Nixon era. And Curtis, can you touch on that?
Yeah. So what I read about it was that, you know, like so many things in politics, it started with Nixon. Like, I find this over and over again in modern politics. In my opinion, a lot of things I don't agree with, but even some things I agree with, it seems like it all kind of started from that era. Nixon used to refer to journalists as the media instead of the press to sort of like make them seem like one entity that, you know, maybe you shouldn't trust. And he did that because he suspected that they didn't like him, and they probably didn't. He wasn't really a likable person.
No, he really wasn't.
I mean, not that you have to be a good, you know, politician, but it helps, you know. And so, yeah, so he kind of started this as a sort of a slur almost, to, you know, to call in the media. It's similar to probably what's going on now and how Trump picked up that same sort of, you know, way of fighting back journalism he doesn't agree with.
But what's really interesting about that too is with the Nixon era, the people loved the press. They, you know, after the Watergate stuff happened, they rallied around the press and they relied on them to tell them the truth. And they, you know, I feel like people trusted a lot more than we do now. So it's interesting to figure out why, you know, targeting the press didn't work for Nixon, but Trump's done a great job of it.
That's true. You know, I mean, and for one thing, I think Nixon might have just been a little ahead of his time because I think he certainly had all of the same setup as Trump does, but he just didn't maybe have as many outlets to get it out. You know, back then there were very few sources of news, and he couldn't control them, you know, as much as he can now. And they weren't necessarily after the most sensational, you know, quote of the day. If you look at like Watergate, or you look at like I think it's called the Vietnam Papers or whatever, you know, that was a huge thing. You know, those stories came out after like months of or at least weeks in some cases of research and really great journalism, some of the best journalism probably ever done, you know. And so, you know, they didn't have the same, so they had a lot more behind their stories than, you know, I think a lot of times now it's easier to refute these things because, you know, the story is only 48 hours old or whatever. And by the time the press catches up with, you know, the facts that really matter to get to people have already made up their minds one way or the other. And that's if they're taking in the kind of quality media that will actually tell them a fair and balanced, you know, version of what happened.
You know, and it's fascinating, and kind of in an attempt to practice what we're preaching. Throughout this, I want to do as best as we can giving you the sources, letting you know where we're getting this information. And so a lot of the information we're talking about right now is from an article called The Fall, Rise, and Fall of Media Trust. And that's by Michael Schudson from the Columbia Journalism Review. And in that, Michael discusses the idea that, and it really didn't pick up until kind of the mid-'60s, especially with a guy like Walter Cronkite, where there weren't these mass, this mainstream media as we discussed today. It's not these national news outlets like CNN and Fox News and whatnot where everybody gets that. Every major metropolitan area had their metro dailies that they got, but even in their editorial pages, they still had some agenda that they leaned towards. And so, especially with, for example, Watergate, when it broke, it was a situation where it was one of the first examples of where, quote unquote, mass media took that out to the entire public, and they saw what, I guess you could say, what power journalism had. And what power journalism had in advocating for the people.
And I'm not sure we ever had any audio leaks like we saw with Nixon, and I think maybe we've desensitized ourselves a bit, because now you see an audio that comes out from this senator or the president or, this person every other day, and it's a little bit of leaked audio, and it's, oh, that's not a good look. But back then, I don't know if we ever had a politician, got him like that.
I'm not sure.
There was the tapes, there was the Nixon tapes, but so much of that was redacted. That was kind of the like they fought to get that released or whatever, and after they fought to get it released, there were like 11 missing minutes or whatever that had all of the incriminating evidence, but it was executive privilege or whatever is how they defended not releasing that to the press, even though Nixon had secretly taped all these people. The other thing too is, if you go back a little further to the McCarthyism days, and I'm getting this mostly from movies like Good Night and Good Luck, which was about Edward R. Murrow. One of the things I took away from that film was how conflicted Edward R. Murrow was in taking any side of an issue that seemed to a lot of people to be pretty clearly wrong. But even though he thought that, he also kept his composure for such a long time. And if you ever seen that movie, it's about him making the decision to take a side on McCarthyism. And that was, a crazy thing to do back then. And it mattered that he did it because he was so trusted, and he was so, he was somebody that held a lot of influence with the American public. And so similar to Walter Cronkite, and some of these people that came up through the news media, what they said mattered. So they were very careful in making and deciding or making any kind of preference toward any story, showing any preference.
What people like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite were able to do, they were able to bring the journalists themselves into America's living room, and they became the face that America trusted. And I think it was in the same article, the Fall, Rise, and Fall of Media Trust. He touches on it again that at the time, and I don't know if it's applicable to today, but journalists were trusted more than the government, but journalists weren't as trusted as the military or corporations or whatnot at the time. And it's an interesting, I guess, ladder that was built in terms of who the American public trusted.
Well, and that's still true today. Both numbers are down, but it's not hard to be more trusted than Congress right now. It's they're at 17% approval rating, so so if journalists are at
tough.
30 or something, they're definitely went down, but they're still more trusted than politicians, and politicians still don't like that. Something in that story too that I thought was interesting. It said mainstream outlets have increasingly emphasized an analysis and news coverage not quite so much who, what, when, where as the why. And that there's been a cultural shift in journalism during that period of the 60s and 70s in that era, and that's true. But I think a lot of people felt like they were wasting their position of power if they didn't lend it to some of the people who needed that attention. So I think a lot of these journalists felt like if that there was some leeway to putting some opinion in the news.
Well, and it's interesting because you look at why the who, what, when, where, and why matters, or the who, what, when, where compared to the why, and it's because if the why is convincing enough to people, the who, what, when, and where don't matter. And I think it's something that, for example, is happening today. There was the story about the African American man who was just shot in Georgia, and I was reading the article, and for those of you who are unaware or don't have full context, it's a story of an African American man. He was on a jog, and he was being followed by two white men, a son and a father, and they got out of the vehicle when he ran past their truck, and the son got out with a shotgun, and he and the runner got in a fight, and he shot and killed the runner. And they said it was because he looked like he matched the description of someone who had been burglarizing the neighborhood recently. And I was reading the article, and I looked at the comments, and someone in the comments said, what if he had just finished killing his baby mama and his son at home, and they, just killed him, and he just committed that murder at his house. And to me, that it just goes to show, and you can call it confirmation bias, where no matter the story, they look for something to confirm their biases. That's when the why matters the most.
So, and there's a term for that now that we call it me media. And it's that we have access to so many media sources now. It is very, very easy to pick and choose where you're getting your news. So if you want to believe something and it matches up with your morals and your values, you can subscribe, hit follow, turn on the radio to whatever stations you want to that, kind of confirm that view of the world you have. But there's so many sources of news. And so there's going to be people on the other end of the spectrum. And then it's extremely conflicting for people who have built this echo chamber of one type of media. And now you have a whole host of people who are liars because it's not what they want to hear.
Yeah. I mean, and you literally are typing keywords into your browser to come up with this, whatever story you're reading or whatever. So depending on how you, what news you search for, you're going to get more of what you're expecting nearly every time.
And that's what I worry about right now is that this fake news term is being thrown about when it really means I don't like that truth. I don't like that, therefore it must be false, and I'm going to go find someone who tells me what I do like. And that makes me nervous because I think journalism is supposed to be honest. It's supposed to be very factual and objective. But now we have people who are pandering to, these individuals who they don't want to hear it. And so I'm not sure how we combat that without just sheer education and media literacy.
And we look at fake news. And so fake news, like I said, it was notoriously used for the first time in 1930s. The lying press, not the same, but we can connect the dots. And then it came up again in 2014, actually in Germany again. And then it really, came to life in 2016 with Donald Trump. And we're not, we're trying to avoid harping on Republicans and harping on Donald Trump as best as we can. But we can't ignore the fact that the center of the idea of fake news is Donald Trump. And so you're going to hear us talking about Donald a lot, and you're going to hear us talking about Republicans a lot. And we're going to counteract it with other points pointing towards other demographics. But it's just important to recognize where these things come from. And it's not necessarily being biased. It's just recognizing, being transparent that it's famous with Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And that's just how it is.
Well, and one of the things I want to do with this podcast is I really want to bring people back together again. while I don't like Trump, from a political standpoint, and even from a personal standpoint, I also try to take his side on some things, if not for nothing else, to sort of like help myself understand why somebody believes differently than I do. And I think it's important that we try to bridge the gap, and even though we're going to talk about him, we're not necessarily going to demonize him, but that also doesn't mean that we're going to treat him, special either, because that would be the other extreme. So to try to walk that sort of middle line, that tightrope, is my goal.
Yeah, and I think we do that with facts, and I think that's what we're missing with a lot of places right now. Because if we just stuck to the facts, it might not always be pretty, and people might not like it, but we've got to get back to that. And so I think that's a great goal for us to have here, because I think we've really strayed from that as a society in general when we're reporting news and talking about it.
That's true. There's a lot of stories that basically are just kind of nudging you, like, see, you were right, like, out there, not really giving you a whole lot more to go with it. With the story that you were just talking about the African American man that was shot. There was somebody posted on, I don't remember if this was a legit site or not, but it was like a video of somebody like walking through a construction site, and it was and over, like, in quotations or whatever, it was like, oh, he was out for a jog, right, or something like that. And this was like a source that was trying to be news-like, and it seemed very, there was no context there. There was no, like, this video was shot during this time, this is what this means. It was like, this is a belief that makes that helps you sustain whatever you already believed.
I think that brings us back to what the idea of fake news really is, because it started out, I think it started out as like literal fake news, like this news either is not correct or is made up. And actually, Trump, he's famous for calling out, MSNBC, CNN, MSN, whatever it may be that isn't Fox News, basically, or a conservative.
Yeah, it's easier to say the ones he likes than the ones he doesn't.
Or, basically anything that isn't right-leaning, he calls out. And, there's a quote by him, the fake news networks, those that knowingly have a sick and biased agenda all caps, are worried about the competition and quality of Sinclair broadcast, I guess.
Oh, right. Yeah. This was it's related to Sinclair broadcast, buying a bunch of networks and all that. But this was actually talking about the fake news awards. I don't know if you said that, maybe it cut out or something. But but this was the fake news awards that was posted on the GOP official website. I think as recently as 2018. It was a really cheap, kind of childish, way of pointing out that, these stories were wrong, therefore don't trust the media, kind of thing. Like that was the insinuation. And in the 10 examples they gave that year that, won the awards for being fake news, most of them had been corrected since, and most of them honestly were kind of petty, little things. It would be like one of them was that Trump had taken I think it was the Lincoln statue or something, like a little Lincoln bust or whatever, out of the White House when he moved in or something. And it was and that was and it's true, it did run in a big paper, and it was retracted that wasn't true, it was still there or whatever. But that part wasn't mentioned in the fake news awards. All that was mentioned was this was fake, therefore don't trust them. And it was just such a small, narrowed view of what all of journalism is.
And it's interesting, and maybe it's just because before I went to college, I didn't pay enough attention to it, but I really didn't, I don't remember, and here's me being, the young millennial, I don't remember so much conversation about, fake news and what's true within media prior to his presidency.
There wasn't like this. I mean, I think I the tone changed so dramatically from even back in 2011, which is when I kind of, started studying journalism, to now. And it's disheartening, to say the least, because we've never seen this much anger and hostility towards the media and the press. And they're very important people. Like, we cannot discount how important the press is. I mean, they bring us stories that we wouldn't have heard otherwise. They help give whistleblowers a voice. It's very scary to think that of the damage we're doing right now of the public perception of journalists. And on the other side of that, journalists have a responsibility too to not, live up to that reputation. I mean, we need to make sure that if we're putting out news, we're fact checking it, we're sticking to the points, we're being objective. And I think both parties have a lot of work to do in terms of trust and in terms of repairing that relationship.
A part of that too is the way the public perceives it. So, for example, Monmouth University did a study or a poll, and this poll showed that 3 out of 4 Americans believe the media is routinely reporting fake news, whether that be left-leaning, right-leaning. Fake news is apparently all over the place, according to the public. And then the Gallup and Knight Foundation also did a study, and they found that 42% of Republicans consider news stories that cast a political group or a politician specifically in negative light as fake news. And so that's when I talk about the idea of what fake news really is, that's where it really comes into question, where is this story really not accurate, or does it just not associate with your, particular view? And once again, Trump is famous for this, where if there is a news source criticizing him, it's fake news. And something that I brought up today on Facebook is public servants, government officials, whether they be state level, local level, highest level of the president, they are public servants. They are at the duty of the
Absolutely.
people. They are elected for a reason, and therefore they are held to a certain scrutiny. And something that happened today actually was Trump's lawyer requested basically immunity as the president for him to not be charged with anything or, have no investigations brought about upon him. And
until he leaves office, at least.
Yeah. And this was in a CNN article, and, they asked her like, well, what's your reasoning? And his lawyer's reasoning was he's the president. And, the president's not above the law. And the issue with that is, well, legal precedent for most things is 5 years. And so if he wins re-election and he has immunity, whatever he's trying to be charged with now that he could be charged with after his presidency, all of a sudden, it loses precedence because it's been longer than 5 years. And so that's the whole issue with that.
Well, the problem too is like, I'm going to say something controversial, but let me explain it though. Technically, the president is above the law, but it's only technically, because what's supposed to happen is if they do something that is criminal, or even not even criminal, not even like you can arrest them for it, but just sort of so immoral or not helpful to like the country, what's supposed to happen is the Congress is supposed to impeach them so that they become a private citizen, so that at that point they cannot be above the law and get charges against them. But what was challenged with Nixon, and he had this famous interview with Frost. I forget his first name, but I think it was Robert. But I can't remember. But
the poet.
He was
the famous poet, Robert Frost.
Oh my God, I gotta look it up. Okay, it wasn't Robert.
And it's kind of what Dick Cheney used to gain most of his power as the vice president, where he manipulated Bush's presidency because basically there's in the the Section 2 or whatever, the Constitution, it basically states that if the president does it, it is therefore legal. Dick Cheney took that to heart, and he used that and abused that as the vice president, and he used that to manipulate and basically take power of, as vice president in a basically useless position.
Yeah, so it was David Frost, not Robert Frost.
Yes, David Frost.
My bad. And the quote was, "When the president does it, it's not illegal." So Richard Nixon was making the case that essentially the president could do anything. Now, but this is an important thing, though. It's like it really goes down to like the founding fathers and like their idea of what the president is and what the president is not. The reason that it's set up so that a president can't officially break the law is that if a president sends, let's say, soldiers into war or something like that, or he orders, let's say, the killing of a of official or something, in another country, like, because he can't be brought to law, it makes it so that whoever disagrees with him in the U.S. can't be like, now you're a murderer, now you can go to jail for murder or whatever. So like it's sort of like that's why there's that separation. Why kind of sort of technically they're not responsible for what they do personally. So I don't know. So I mean, there's but at the same time, it's meant to protect them against like the jobs of the president, not their personal like lives, So like Trump's taxes is his personal life. Mm-hmm. Whether or not he's profiting illegally off of being president is not protected, in my opinion, under that statute.
And I would like to point out also that his presidency is the presidency, but his campaign is his personal life. And there's a distinction between that as well.
There's two different things that the Supreme Court is seeing right now. One is about his candidacy pre-2016 or 2016 and before, and the other one is during his presidency. So there's actually two separate cases. One is filed by the state of New York, and the other one, I'm not looking at it in front of me, but the other one I think is federal. Oh, the other one was the House of Representatives.
Right.
The other one was from the House of Representatives. Yeah. So the cleverness though about it is the Supreme Court could decide that maybe his taxes while he's president for some reason isn't fair game, but the taxes before he became president is.
All right. So let's bring it back to media though, because we've been talking about fake news and the idea that so much of it is based on your biases, aka your opinions. I really want to differentiate opinion and news. And so starting off with that, let's get the definitions. And so a lot of this information we're going to bring up right now is provided by the Digital Resource Center. It's the Center for News Literacy, and it's a great resource. They have fantastic lessons on there that are really short and to the point and really bring out what is most important in terms of journalism and news for the public. So if you do have any questions about, just how the media works or the history of it or, the context of it, the Digital Resource Center is a very, very good source to, get educated on that kind of stuff. But so news is timely information about a subject of some public interest that is shared and subject to the journalistic process of verification by an independent organization that is accountable. And then opinion, a view, a judgment, or an appraisal formed in the mind about a particular matter. One aspect of opinion that, was very prominent, especially in today's society, and especially, since what you might consider modern times of media progressing from the 80s, is talk radio. And so what happened in 1949, there was something called the Fairness Doctrine that was put into place by the FCC. And basically what the Fairness Doctrine did was it made it so that radio news outlets had to, one, they were required to broadcast on matters that were controversial and of importance to the public. And two, they were required to broadcast opposing sides. They had to counteract one bias with another. It was, I guess, a way to, counteract kind of the dirty journalism that was happening in the early 1900s. And so that went on all the way until 1987, during Reagan's presidency, when his FCC removed that. And so all of a sudden, go ahead, Curtis.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, the important like word in that is required.
Yes.
Because at the time, the news or the broadcast stations, they had no interest in news. Like news for decades was a huge money loss to these networks. So they saw it as, so the trade off was, okay, NBC, CBS, I think ABC was the other one. We'll let you use federal airwaves, but for that, you're going to have this many minutes of news per day.
Yep.
And so the broadcast channels were like, kicking the can, all right, and so they kind of just did it as a public service, and then flash forward to later on where it became more successful.
And that's what you'll hear. So I worked for, it was Talk 1370, Intercom Communications in Austin. They're an AM news station, talk news station. It was right-leaning, so we had guys like, Sean Hannity. We had, who is it? Brian something or other. Can't think of it, but it was right-leaning. And, you'll hear your news at the top of the hour. And for, at 6:03, the 3 minutes after every hour, you'll hear it's just the news. And then all of a sudden they'll go back to their, opinioneering. All of a sudden Hannity comes back with her, whatever it may be. And, going back to that, in 1987, Reagan took that fairness doctrine away. And part of it also was because the AM waves were dying. Like the industry was just not surviving compared to FM, where music became so much more popular. And so all of a sudden this fairness doctrine gets taken away. So basically you can broadcast whatever, views or opinions you want. And then the AM waves were so cheap to buy. They were cheap stations to buy. And so all of a sudden you get these right-leaning and religious leaders in the industry who are struggling to find, a place in the media.
An outlet,
exactly. I think that's a great word. It's an outlet. They purchase this in that, starting with a guy like Rush Limbaugh, who's kind of the OG of talk radio. And ever since, Republican talk radio or right-leaning talk radio has dominated the airways. And you'll find today that, I think you'll see, especially with podcast, it's more left-leaning, but in terms of talk radio or political or news talk radio specifically is absolutely dominated by the right.
Totally. Yeah. It was crazy to see Donald Trump give Rush Limbaugh, what was it, the Medal of
is it like
Medal of Freedom?
The Freedom, yeah, the Medal of Freedom or something.
That was crazy because, like, it was sort of like, it was like a good job for like paving the way for opinion news, for telling the conservative point of view, but without the other side to back it up or whatever.
Well, and you have to wonder, I mean, you both touched on it, like this came about because people didn't feel like they had an outlet for this. So there was an audience for this and people who didn't feel like the news spoke to them. And so what I wonder is, did the news not speak to them because it wasn't, we talked about this, saying things that they wanted to say, or is the news really, left-leaning? And it does tend to skew liberal. And in that case, you have to understand why someone would want to hear something from the other side. But either way, there was a need for it, and there were people who didn't feel like that need was being met. So why weren't journalists filling that void?
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, it seems like most of the time when needs aren't met, it's usually because it's considered to be a niche audience, or and one of the things that has happened with AM radio and then with cable and then with the internet, is that it because there's so many more stations available to happen, literally more room on the airwaves, and then if it's through cable, just unlimited pretty much, number of channels you can have, like the rise of niche everything is giving a lot of people who maybe would have been sort of overlooked the chance to have their own network or whatever. That's totally where a lot of these things come from. Is it's like, well, why don't we represent the 20 to 30% of like extremely right-wing people, and then the left is the same way. Why don't we represent the extremely, 20 to 30% of very left-leaning people? And then 24 hours a day, they start representing them.
Yeah, and I think in a perfect world, we would have a society that only wanted news that was factual. It didn't matter how it made you feel. It doesn't matter if it upsets you because it goes against what you want to believe or because what you do believe. Somehow we strayed from, data sets and from factual information to, I'm just going to find a news source that makes me feel a little bit better about the day. And you can do that now. And so I think that's what journalists have to battle now in these mainstream media sources is how do you convey the news in a way that makes people trust you, even though you're probably saying some stuff they don't want to hear?
Well, and it feels like, a lot of these networks that say like the high, let's say New York Times website and, say One American Network website or whatever, like, they feel like they're the same on your computer. Like unless you really look at like, maybe the quality of the images or something, like, as far as it just being like piped to you, like it feels the same. It's on the same level. So you can't just sort of be the news anymore by default. Like you can only rely on your name so much. You have to really remind people, that, okay, you shouldn't listen to us just because we're the New York Times, we've been around forever. You should listen to us because, we are accountable. Like the definition of news you just read, what makes them accountable. So, technically I always think the bigger the media outlet, the more accountable they have to be, because if they're wrong, it'll cost them even more. Like who cares if, some Yahoo, on, a podcaster says something wrong or whatever, like that has a modest reach. There's not a lot of money behind it, not a lot of advertising and all that stuff. You don't have the name yet, but once you start building that name and you have that huge, network to protect, suddenly everything becomes really important to be accurate. So I trust, like, for example, I posted a story from New York Times on Facebook, and a conservative friend of mine, his only comment on it, like I wasn't even sure if he read it, honestly. His only comment on it was, "Oh, we should just trust the mainstream media." And I was like, no, that's not what this is about. Yeah, they're the New York Times. You should probably give it at least a look. They're probably the most like well-funded, research engine, that there is in the country. So yeah, they probably, have more to lose if they're wrong, therefore are probably more likely to be right. But no, it doesn't mean that you should trust them more. But at the same time, like, I think reasonably there's a higher chance of accuracy.
And I find it interesting that you bring up the size, like the fact that the size of these organizations matter, because then you get, in the case, and we touched a little bit on them before, and we'll get into it a little bit closer right now, but a group like Sinclair Broadcasting. And so for those who don't know, Sinclair Broadcasting is, they're a massive corporation that owns the largest amount of local news stations in the country. And in the face of, the fake news, honestly, the fake news pandemic that we're facing right now, ironically, local news is kind of the safe haven where you can look to them as, because most local news stations your local news TV stations don't carry, editorial segments as much as these, massive nationally broadcasted newscasts. But you get Sinclair Broadcasting where they run things like must runs. Hey everyone, this is Dalen coming back through while I'm editing this episode. Just wanted to clarify a little bit on this clip that we're about to run. So this is a clip that kind of went around the internet, and it's basically layering all of the local newscasts that did these must runs that Sinclair sent out, layered on top of each other. So this is not what the stations had to play. This is what all of the stations, the script that they had to say, but layered on top of each other to show how vast this issue is and the grasp that Sinclair really has on our local news. So I just wanted to clarify. I didn't want you to think that this is what they're playing, because it's not. The words that they are saying is what they are required to say. That is what the must run is. But this clip shows just how vast it really is.
Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
You know, how do you put trust into a news organization that just completely creates robots of their newscasters? You know, it completely desensitizes them from what they're supposed to be informing the public about. It's just like, hey, we're reading this. These are words.
It's funny because on Facebook the other day, I saw one of my more conservative family members posted something and they were like, this is Project Mockingbird. And I'm like, oh, the Hunger Games. No, it was a clip of all of those. And it was all those news reporters saying that at the same time. And they were like, this is what the news is doing to you. It's brainwashing you. It's this. And I was like,
and it was a Trump thing.
And it was, not quite the same thing. But I think, yeah, no, Dalen, to your point, it's true. Like when we do that, it doesn't do anything to help the trust if people are under the correct impression that sometimes nationwide, every individual news station is getting one script from one corporation.
I mean,
and that's a key word
undermines
too. Corporation.
Yeah,
it's an ugly word.
It completely undermines like local news. I mean, like it's so the reason, like, let's just get right to it. The reason that I don't like Trump has nothing to do with his political beliefs. Like, he could have my exact political beliefs and I wouldn't like him. And the reason I don't like him is that he says one thing and then he says the exact opposite next. You know, so like I always call him like a broken clock. Like a broken clock is right twice a day, right? Just by like sheer like coincidence. Like, and so like. So he just says whatever with no like context to what he said before. So like no reference to what he says before. So like with Sinclair News, like he was like, oh yeah, great, Sinclair News is great or whatever. But like that is like the opposite of what he should be for. You know, he should not be like, just because he believes that say Sinclair is more conservative or whatever. Like that's not what he used to say he was for. He used to say he was for, sort of like grassroots, like real, news. Don't believe the corporate, mainstream media. Believe the local, I don't know if he said local news, but like, believe like the kind of the ones in the trenches or whatever, like the real news. And here's like Sinclair News is like faceless corporation that is doing as bad or worse, but with them it's okay.
And this might be a controversial opinion depending on what side of the aisle you're on, but I do think that journalists need to step up more, and it's okay to call these politicians out. When Donald Trump has, recorded clips of him saying two different things, and he is denying both of them, we pass it off so often because he just does so much ridiculous stuff, as do many politicians, and we let it go. And I think journalists do need to step up to the plate a bit more, and it's okay for us to call people out. It's okay for us to be like, you just said these two conflicting things. You can't tell me you didn't say that. And I think sometimes we get too scared to say anything.
And I think maybe one of the reasons that people, when they read a story that says something negative about a politician and they call that fake news, I think the reason that they are so negative so quickly is because they're thinking of it more as a call out and less as a need to understand. If the story is written from the perspective of like Trump said the sky is blue and then Trump said the sky is red, which is it, Mr. President? Like if it's a way to understand him and to figure out whether or not you disagree after you understand, that's one thing. And I think like a lot of conservatives, not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them would read both of those statements and be like, that is confusing. You know, like I believe in this, but I still think it's confusing. He could have said that in a better way or whatever. But if the story is like, if it feels left leaning and it feels like they're calling him out just to do it, like then I think they sort of turn their brains switch off and it just turns into fake news, ignore it all, you know, that kind of thing, because it seems so much more like challenging versus like trying to understand.
Yeah, the intent is definitely important. As consumers, we do have a responsibility to make sure that, especially if you're going to click share or you're going to retweet something, to make sure that it's grounded in some type of fact. You have a responsibility if you're going to start doing that, and if you're going to start talking about these things like it's fact, to, hey, go find another source, or just pay attention to the wording that's being used. How many sources are there? Is there any data there? Mm-hmm. Is there a professional talking about something? I
think a great example going on with the pandemic right now is so many YouTube videos of, you know, these nurses that get on and like, you know, I'm not going to name the hospital, and I'm not going to name my friend who's on the front lines in New York, and I'm not going to name these patients that I've dealt with, but the media is lying to you. And it's like, well, but, you know, where's the transparency? How do we know you're not just making this up? How do we know you have real sources? How do we know you actually have a friend in New York? How do we know that you're actually a nurse? And yet people will share these videos.
Yeah.
I mean, conservatives say the same thing, though. You know, like I think there's some misunderstanding of the difference between somebody saying this on YouTube, you know, and not having a source, and a journalist that is citing an unnamed source. Like basic things like that. Conservatives see, you know, a news story that says Trump said this according to an unnamed source, and they think the same thing you thought about that nurse on YouTube.
You can't blame someone for that. And you are taught in journalism school, avoid anonymous sources at all cost, unless, you know, that's the only way to do the story. Otherwise, you know, that's the way that you get people to trust you. You give them the sources. And I think as consumers, we have to understand that we have to digest the news, and just because we don't like it doesn't mean it's not true. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
All right, guys, and on that, we are coming up on time. We're at about an hour. This is roughly about how long we want each episode to be. But I hope what we accomplished today was creating context and really establishing what the idea of fake news is and what we're dealing with in today's media. And we're going to split this up into a two-parter. So coming up next week, what we want to do along with you is really learn how to be news literate. How can we consume all of this in a responsible way and disperse it amongst ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think the feeling I get from a lot of people, particularly younger people, is that it's sort of like, it just feels so daunting, so negative all the time that like a lot of times we just sort of want to cast it away and not think about it, you know, but it's so important that like we actually have a legit media out there that informs us about what's going on. So it's not, you know, a surprise one day when something changes and you had no idea, you know, and to be a part of that change. So yeah, I'm really excited about talking about that next week with like, you know, okay, here we find ourselves in this era of you know, questionable news and questionable politics. You know, how do we solve this? How do we start bringing people together from conservative and from liberal, you know, extremes and the moderates all together to figure out, at least to some degree, what the truth is, what we can argue about, but in a civil way, and how we can move forward from all this.
You know, I think we do not live in a climate that makes it easy to trust the news right now. But whose fault is that? That's a whole another episode. But it's very difficult right now to consume news and know what you're reading. So I think you do have to consciously make an effort to seek out factual news and to constantly be checking your own biases as you're reading, and to make sure that as you're reading through things, you can pick up on little things that stand out to you as, well, that's something to maybe flag for later, or that's something to think about. And so I think I would like to explore ways of doing that in a way that's manageable, because it's not realistic to say, oh, to find the true news, you need to go read 10 news sources every day. So how do we read the news in a manageable way that's accurate, but that's still in a responsible manner?
All right. So, guys, this is going to be kind of a fluid process, so work with us here. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope we, made you think of news differently, and we hope that you come back next week to, hopefully find those answers that we're also looking for. And if there was something that raised your eyebrow during this episode that you want us to touch base on, you can reach out to us at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/PWBN. If there's anything that, and another part is transparency, if there's something that we just outlandishly got wrong, let us know. We want to correct that. We don't want to be, part of the issue. Like I said, we want to practice what we preach. But please shoot us an email, pwbnetwork@gmail.com. And yeah, thanks for listening. We hope you come back next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Social Discord, part of the Podcast Without Borders Network. You can get a hold of us by sending us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/PWBN. Thanks for listening.